A newlywed millionaire goes down to the basement of his mansion with his maid 6-year-old daughter when the girl points to a freshly painted wall and says, "Sir, it's behind this wall." When his wife comes running and desperately begs him not to touch the wall, he notices something strange in her despair. Grabbing a hammer, he decides to uncover what is truly hidden there. What he finds changes everything. The Sunday sun spilled a lazy, golden light over the mansion's gardens, but it was the sparkle in Arthur's eyes that truly lit up the day. Hand in hand with little Lena, the 6-year-old daughter of his faithful housekeeper, he descended the polished stone steps leading to the newly renovated wine cellar. The cool air and the smell of damp earth mingled curiously with the pungent odor of fresh paint, a scent that to him signified renewal and happiness. His wife, Isabella, had overseen every detail of the renovation while he was on a business trip, and the result, he already knew, would be impeccable. Everything Isabella touched turned to perfection. She was his perfection. Married for only 6 months, he still felt like a love-struck teenager, unable to believe his luck in finding her. She was the calm to his storm, the beauty to his pragmatic days. "Watch your step, little princess," he said softly, squeezing Lena's tiny hand. The girl hopped down the last step, her dark curls bouncing. She adored Arthur and his giant house, a fairy tale castle where she could play hide and seek and listen to his stories. For Arthur, the girl's presence was a pure, uncomplicated joy. He flipped on the cellar lights, and the space revealed itself. Shelves of solid oak, filled with dusty bottles, lined the walls in organized rows. At the far end, a smooth, immaculate wall, painted in a shade of light gray, replaced the old, uneven stonework. It was elegant, modern, a touch of Isabella in the ancient heart of the house. "Look at that, Lena. What do you think? Didn't Aunt Bella do an incredible job?" He beamed, waiting for the little one's approval. He felt proud, as if the finished work were a reflection of his successful marriage, solid and well-crafted. Lena, however, wasn't looking at the shelves or the new lighting. Her large brown eyes were fixed on the freshly painted wall. She moved closer, stretching out her little finger as if to touch the smooth surface, but stopped inches away. She tilted her head, a frown of concentration on her small brow. Arthur found the scene adorable, the childlike seriousness with which she inspected the work. "Do you like the new color?" he asked, walking toward her to select a wine for the small reception they were hosting later. Lena didn't answer immediately. She turned to him, the conspiratorial look of someone about to share a monumental secret. She placed her index finger over her lips and then pointed to the wall again. In a whisper that barely broke the cellar's silence, she spoke words that seemed to suck all the warmth from Arthur's body, leaving a piercing cold in its place. "Mister," she murmured, her eyes wide with importance, "Auntie's treasure is behind this wall. She hid a box with some men and said it was our little secret." For a moment, Arthur thought it was a game, a child's fantasy, but the seriousness on Lena's face was unshakable. The smell of fresh paint suddenly became suffocating, mingling with a premonition that sent a chill down his spine. Just then, he heard hurried footsteps on the stairs. Isabella appeared at the cellar entrance, her face pale, a forced smile on her lips. "Darling, I thought you two were down here. Clara is looking for you. Lena." Her eyes, however, weren't on the girl. They were locked on Arthur, flashing with a desperation he had never seen before. She saw where he was looking, at the immaculate wall. Rushing to his side, she touched his arm, her voice a sharp, dramatic plea. "Arthur, please, darling, don't listen to a child's imagination. Let's go upstairs. Please, don't ruin the new paint." Isabella's touch on his arm, once a safe harbor, now felt like a chain, pulling him away from an uncomfortable truth. Arthur looked from his wife's pale, pleading face to little Lena, who was now shrinking back, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmosphere. The innocence in her eyes was a beacon in the fog of confusion forming in his mind. A child's imagination, perhaps. But the panic in Isabella's eyes was no fantasy. It was real, palpable, and jarringly out of place. Why such desperation over a freshly painted wall? He tried to force a smile, searching for a middle ground that would appease them both. Easy, my love. Of course I won't ruin anything. Lena was just playing, weren't you, sweetie? He winked at the girl, a silent plea for her to play along and ease the unbearable tension. But Lena just shook her head, her lips forming a stubborn pout. It's a secret, but it's true, she insisted in her firm whisper. Isabella let out a laugh, but the sound was fragile, brittle. Oh, darling, you take her so seriously. She has a wild imagination. The other day she told me a dragon was sleeping in the garden. Come on, the guests are arriving. She pulled him more firmly, her body positioning itself between him and the wall, a beautiful human shield. He let her lead him, climbing the steps back into the sunlight, but his heart remained in the cold darkness of the cellar. With every step, doubt grew like poison ivy, wrapping around his thoughts. During the small garden party, he tried to focus on the conversations, the laughter of friends, the taste of the wine he'd chosen, but his mind was a split screen. On one side, he saw Isabella, radiant and sociable, the perfect hostess, telling charming anecdotes. On the other, he saw the image of that grey wall and Lena's whispered voice. He watched his wife. Every gesture, once interpreted as grace and spontaneity, now seemed calculated. The way she touched a guest's arm while laughing, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about the renovation, it all felt like a performance. He felt like a fool. He was letting a 6-year-old's fantasy poison the trust he had in the woman of his life. He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the overwhelming love he felt for her. He remembered how she had saved him from loneliness after his parents' death, how she had filled the house and his life with a joy he thought he had lost forever. She was good, kind, perfect. There couldn't be anything sinister behind her loving eyes. Later, when the last guests had left and night fell upon the mansion, the house's silence amplified the noise in his head. Isabella went upstairs to take a shower, humming a soft tune. He said he was going to his office to check some emails, a weak excuse. As soon as he heard the water running, he went back down to the cellar. The smell of paint was still strong. Standing before the wall, he felt like an intruder in his own home. He ran his fingers over the surface. It was smooth, cold, impenetrable. Maybe it was just that, a wall. But then, under the dim light of a single bulb, something caught his eye, near the baseboard. In an almost hidden corner, the texture of the paint was subtly different. There was a slight ripple, almost imperceptible, as if that section had dried unevenly. Leaning down, he pressed the spot with his thumb. The wall seemed solid, but for a fraction of a second, he thought he felt a hollow echo, a minimal void behind the plaster. That hollow echo, however small, was the spark that ignited his determination. The sound of running water upstairs was now a clock, ticking down the time he had before his life, as he knew it could either crumble or be reaffirmed. A wave of guilt washed over him. He was about to commit an act of monumental distrust, an act of vandalism against the home they had built together, all based on the word of a child and a growing paranoia. What if there was nothing there? How would he explain a hole in the pristine wall Isabella loved so much? The shame of the silent accusation would be unbearable. But the image of the panic in her eyes was stronger. Panic wasn't the reaction of someone whose new wall was in danger. It was the reaction of someone whose secret was about to be exposed. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he went up the stairs silently, not into the house, but toward the side door that led to the garden. The night was cool, and the scent of jasmine hung in the air, a painful contrast to the bitterness forming in his mouth. He crossed the dewy lawn to the small tool shed, the place where he kept rakes, shovels, and, mercifully, a heavy hammer. The metal tool felt cold and foreign in his hand. He, a man who built financial empires with phone calls and contracts, was now holding a tool of demolition. The irony was suffocating. Returning to the cellar, every step was an internal debate. One part of him screamed to stop, to go back to his wife, the woman who made him laugh, who cared for him, who loved him. Another part, a darker, more insistent voice, whispered that love couldn't be built on a hollow foundation. Standing once more before the grey wall, he took a deep breath. The smell of paint was almost nauseating. He raised the hammer. For one last agonizing second, he hesitated. The image of Isabella's face, smiling at him that very morning, flashed in his mind. "I love you, Arthur," she had said. And he had believed it with every fiber of his being. With a groan of anguish, he swung. The sound was shocking, a dull explosion that echoed in the cellar's silence. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on the smooth paint. He hit it again and again, rage and fear fueling his movements. Chunks of plaster and paint fell to the floor, revealing not the old stone he expected, but a sheet of drywall. It was a false wall. With trembling hands, he tore away the broken pieces of plasterboard, creating an opening. The dust made him cough, but he didn't stop. He reached into the dark hole and felt something cold and rectangular. He pulled it out carefully, his heart racing. It was a dark metal briefcase, the kind used for important documents. This wasn't a child's treasure. It was something real, deliberately hidden. He placed it on the stone floor, the sound of metal on stone echoing his final decision. The latches gave way with a sharp click. He opened the lid. Inside, carefully organized, were stacks of papers, passports, and ID cards. He picked up the first passport he saw. The photo was unmistakably Isabella, with the same captivating smile. But the name printed below it, in crisp, official letters, made his blood run cold and the world stop spinning. It wasn't Isabella Hayes. It was Katarina Rostova. Katarina Rostova. The name echoed in the silence of the cellar, a cruel dissonance that shattered the symphony of his life. Each letter felt like a blow, undoing the image of Isabella Hayes, the sweet-smiled woman with a simple past he had learned to love. He flipped through the other documents, with hands that didn't feel like his own, other identities, other names, but always the same face. The woman upstairs wasn't a person. She was a collection of characters. The sound of the shower stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was more deafening than any noise. She would be coming down. Cold, sharp panic pierced his stupor. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not knowing so little. Confronting her now would be giving her the chance to manipulate, to invent another story, to flee. He needed time, needed to understand the extent of the lie. Acting on pure instinct, he closed the briefcase, shoved it deep inside the hole in the wall, and tried to replace the largest pieces of drywall to disguise the damage. A futile, desperate attempt. His hands were covered in white dust. He wiped them on his pants, his heart beating wildly. He heard her footsteps at the top of the stairs. "Arthur, honey, is everything okay down there? You're taking a while." Her voice, the same velvety voice that whispered promises of love in his ear, now sounded like a siren's call. Dangerous and false. "Coming right up, honey," he called out, forcing his voice to sound normal, casual. "Just checking for any dampness after the renovation." He climbed the steps, forcing a smile as he met her in the hallway. She was wearing her silk robe, her damp hair wrapped in a towel. She looked ethereal, vulnerable, a perfect lie. "So, any sign of dampness, my private detective?" she teased, wrapping her arms around his neck. The scent of her shampoo, an aroma he had once loved, now made him sick. He hugged her back, the gesture a betrayal of himself. "No, everything's perfect, like everything you do." The words came out like ash in his mouth, but she didn't seem to notice. She kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss. To Arthur, it was like kissing a statue of ice. The night was a torment. Lying beside her in bed, he feigned sleep, listening to her calm, rhythmic breathing. How could she sleep so peacefully? Harboring a universe of secrets, he, on the other hand, felt like an imposter in his own bed, in his own life. At dawn, feeling exhausted and fragile, he watched her get ready for the day. Every movement was graceful, every word affectionate. It was a flawless performance, and he was the only audience member who now knew he was watching a play. Later, he saw Lena playing near the rose garden. The girl was his only thread of truth. He approached her, his heart heavy. "Lena," he began, sitting on the grass beside her. "About yesterday's secret, can you tell me more about the men who helped Aunt Bella?" Lena stopped picking a small flower and looked up at him, her eyes serious. "There were two of them, a tall one and one with a mustache. They didn't talk like us." Arthur felt a shiver. "No, how did they talk?" The girl frowned, trying to remember. "They spoke a funny, twisty-sounding language. And Aunt Bella talked to them like that too. She told me it was a game, another one of our little secrets." Arthur swallowed hard, his throat tight. Isabella had always told him she was terrible with languages, that she could barely remember the little Spanish she'd learned in high school. It was another piece of the puzzle, another layer of deceit. He looked up at the house, where the woman he knew as Isabella was standing at the window, smiling and waving at them. But he no longer saw his wife. He saw Katerina Rostova, a polyglot, an actress, a complete and terrifying stranger. Lena's revelation about the foreign language was like a lit match to a trail of gunpowder. Every lie, no matter how small, now seemed connected to a larger conspiracy, more elaborate than he could have ever imagined. For the next week, Arthur lived in a state of constant high alert, a reluctant actor in his own tragedy. He became a meticulous observer, analyzing every word, every gesture from Katerina. He couldn't think of her as Isabella anymore. It was a silent torture. He'd see her answer the phone and his body would tense. He'd see her on the computer and wonder who she was communicating with, in what language, about what secrets. The mansion, once his sanctuary, had transformed into a stage of suspicion. The wide hallways felt narrow, and the walls, once witnesses to his happiness, now seemed complicit in the deception. His innate generosity, his blind trust in the people he loved, was being eroded, replaced by a cold, cutting paranoia. He felt weak, humiliated. How could he have been so naive? How could he have given his heart and his trust to a mirage? The vulnerability she had so praised in him, calling it his greatest strength, now revealed itself as his greatest weakness, the entry point for his ruin. One night, unable to bear the charade any longer, he waited for her to fall into a deep sleep. With his heart in his throat, he slipped out of bed and descended once more to the cellar. The hole in the wall, poorly disguised, was an ugly reminder of his new reality. He retrieved the briefcase and took it to his office, locking the door behind him. Under the cold light of his desk lamp, he examined the contents more calmly. Besides the fake passports and IDs, there was a thick envelope. Inside, a collection of photographs. His stomach churned. They were photos of Katerina, or whoever she was, with other men, older men, clearly wealthy, on yachts, at gala dinners, on the balconies of luxurious hotels. In every photo, she wore the same loving smile, the same devoted gaze she now directed at him. One photo, dated just over a year ago, showed her arm in arm with a European oil magnate. The caption in a celebrity magazine describing her as his radiant fiancée. This was the period she claimed to have been emotionally recovering, at an isolated retreat, healing from a toxic relationship before meeting him. The entire story was a fiction. He wasn't the love of her life. He was just next on the list, the next project, the next target. The pain that hit him was physical, a sharp stab in his chest that took his breath away. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was the annihilation of his history, the negation of every happy moment they had shared. Every "I love you," every laugh, every promise was false, a well-rehearsed script. He felt stripped of his own memories, as if a thief had broken into his mind and stolen his past. He looked at the wedding band on his finger, the gold cold and heavy. It was a symbol not of a union, but of a successful con. In that moment, under the lonely light of his office, the trusting, generous man began to disintegrate, and in his place, a skeptical, wounded man began to emerge. He knew he needed help. He couldn't face this alone. He needed someone who could see through the lies, someone who could give him concrete answers. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of his lawyer and old friend, his voice trembling as he whispered the first words, "Richard, I need you. I think I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Richard arrived the next morning, his serious expression a stark contrast to the mansion's sunny facade. Arthur met him at the gate, far from the prying ears of Katerina, who was busy in the garden, pruning roses with an almost theatrical dedication. He handed the lawyer a flash drive with digital copies of all the documents and photos from the briefcase, the transaction feeling clandestine and dirty. "Be discreet. Richard, please, she can't know that I know anything. Not yet," Arthur pleaded, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Richard, a pragmatic and direct man, just nodded, his eyes conveying a mixture of concern and determination. "Leave it with me, Arthur. I'll find out who she really is." The wait for results was a new form of torture. Katerina, oblivious to the gathering storm, seemed even more attentive and loving. She cooked his favorite meals, suggested weekend trips, talked about plans for the future, about children. Every affectionate word was a knife twisting in Arthur's wound. He felt like a tightrope walker, struggling to maintain his composure, to smile at the right moments, to keep the bitterness from showing in his eyes. The worst part was the constant presence of Lena. The girl, his unwitting little hero, continued to move through the house with her innocent joy. Arthur felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, an almost paternal need. He'd see her chatting animatedly with Katerina, and his blood would run cold. The woman he now saw as a predator was interacting with the only honest person in his house. He began to make a point of always being nearby when the two were together, a protective shadow that Katerina might interpret as affection, but which was, in fact, pure vigilance. He saw how Katerina treated Lena, with a condescending kindness, a superficial affection, as if the girl were a charming accessory to the house, little more than a knick-knack. To Katerina, Lena was invisible, insignificant, and that invisibility, Arthur realized, was the girl's greatest weapon. The days dragged on. The tension in Arthur was a knot tightening in his stomach. He barely ate, barely slept. His company, the empire he had built with such effort, seemed distant and unimportant. All that mattered was the drama unfolding under his own roof. One afternoon, while reading a book on the patio, pretending to relax, he observed a scene that confirmed his worst fears. Katerina was on the phone, her back to him, speaking in a low voice. He got up and walked silently, hiding behind a large hedge. She wasn't speaking English. It was a Slavic language, harsh and fast, the same one Lena had described as funny and twisty. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was cold, calculating, professional. There was no trace of the sweet, emotional woman he knew. She hung up the phone, and for a moment, her face went blank. The mask dropped. Her expression was one of predatory coldness, her eyes narrow, her mouth a thin line. Then she turned, and upon seeing him approach, the warm smile returned instantly, as if she had flipped a switch. "Darling, were you there?" I didn't see you." The transition was seamless, terrifying. In that moment, he understood he wasn't dealing with a simple liar. He was dealing with a professional. And he, the man who prided himself on his ability to judge character, was her latest and perhaps most valuable prey. The phone in his pocket vibrated. It was Richard. "Arthur, I found something, and it's worse than we imagined. We need to meet now." Arthur met Richard in a discreet coffee shop downtown, an anonymous place where no one would recognize them. The air conditioning blew a frigid draft, but it was nothing compared to the chill that settled in his veins as Richard began to speak. The lawyer didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward Arthur. "Your marriage isn't valid, Arthur." The sentence landed on the table like a stone. Arthur stared at the screen. It was a digitized marriage certificate, issued in a small Eastern European country. The bride's photo was unmistakably Katerina Rostova, but the groom wasn't him. It was a severe-looking, much older man. And the marriage, dated 3 years prior, was still legally active. "She's a bigamist," Richard said, his voice low and grave. "From what I can gather, this man, Dmitry Volkov, is an oligarch with dangerous connections. He disappeared about a year ago, presumed dead in a yachting accident, but the body was never found. Legally, she's still his widow, or his wife, if he's alive." The revelation hit him with the force of a punch. Bigamy. The word sounded vulgar, dirty, torn from the pages of a cheap novel. But it was his reality. The wedding he had celebrated, the union he considered sacred, was a legal sham, a nullity. He wasn't her husband. He was just an unwitting accomplice to a crime. Richard continued, each word deepening the abyss beneath Arthur's feet. "And there's more. I looked into your finances, like you asked, in the last few months. Ever since you gave her that power of attorney to manage some low-risk investments, substantial amounts of money have been siphoned from your accounts. Small enough not to raise immediate red flags, but the total sum is alarming. The money is being funneled into numbered accounts in tax havens, all linked to shell companies. The betrayal, which had seemed purely emotional, now had a sharp, brutal financial edge. It wasn't just his heart she was stealing, it was his legacy, his life's work. The cellar renovation, the safe investments, her business trips, it all fit into a meticulous, predatory plan. She didn't love him. She was emptying him out, piece by piece, smile by smile. Arthur rested his head in his hands, a buzzing in his ears drowning out the coffee shop's ambient noise. He felt a profound nausea, a mix of anger, pain, and overwhelming humiliation. He had been the perfect fool, trusting, generous, in love, a textbook target. "What do I do, Richard?" he whispered, his voice broken. Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with the compassion Arthur rarely saw in his pragmatic friend. "For now, nothing. You play the game. We can't spook her. We need more information. We need to understand the scope of this operation. This feels bigger than just her." The thought of going home, of looking at Katerina, of sleeping beside her, knowing all of this, seemed impossible. But he knew Richard was right. He had to be stronger, more calculating than she was. He had to wear the same mask she wore so well. Returning to the mansion that afternoon, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a painful beauty he could barely stand. Katerina greeted him at the door with a kiss. "I missed you, my love. Where have you been?" He looked into her eyes, the blue depths that had once mesmerized him, and for the first time he saw no love. He saw the reflection of an empty vault, putting out some fires at work. He lied, the first of many lies he would have to tell. As he walked past her, he saw Lena sitting on the stairs, hugging a doll. The girl looked at him and gave a small, shy smile. In that instant, Arthur felt a piercing clarity. The battle was no longer just about his heart or his money. It was about protecting that little witness, and he would do anything to keep her safe. The following weeks turned into an emotional minefield. Arthur perfected his performance, moving through his house and his life like a ghost of his former self. He smiled, made small talk, agreed to Katerina's plans for the future, all while his insides twisted into a knot of revulsion and fear. Paranoia, once a nascent feeling, became his constant companion. Every phone call she took made him pause to listen. Every outing, to meet friends, was logged in his mind with suspicion. He became a spy in his own home, scrutinizing credit card statements, checking computer histories, searching for any clue that might reveal the true extent of her network. The naive, open-hearted man was being buried under layers of suspicion and calculation. It was a transformation that scared him, but he knew it was necessary for his survival. His relationship with Lena changed too. He no longer saw just the adorable daughter of his housekeeper. He saw an ally, a keeper of the truth, and, increasingly, a responsibility. He spent more time with her, using the excuse that he loved her company. He read her stories in the garden, helped her with drawings, and listened intently to her detailed descriptions of the world through her 6-year-old eyes. In these conversations, he subtly questioned her about the renovation, about the men who had worked with Katerina. The girl's memory was frighteningly precise. She recalled snippets of conversations she'd overheard, names Katerina had mentioned on the phone, license plates she'd seen. Every detail she provided, however trivial it seemed, was a piece Arthur passed on to Richard, who in turn assembled the puzzle of an international criminal operation. Katerina, at first, seemed to find Arthur's growing affection for the girl charming. "It's so sweet how you've taken to her," she commented one evening as they watched Arthur and Lena build a block castle in the living room. "You're going to be a wonderful father." The word father hit him like a punch. The irony was cruel. He was playing the role of a father figure to the one person who could destroy the woman who dreamed of being the mother of his children. However, Arthur's attention did not go completely unnoticed for long. Katerina began to watch. Her eyes would narrow subtly when she saw Arthur and Lena whispering in a corner. She started interrupting their conversations more frequently, suggesting Lena go help her mother, Clara, or play outside. One day, the shift in attitude became undeniable. Clara, Lena's mother, came to Arthur, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Arthur, I'm sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Isabella, she said it might be better for Lena not to spend so much time inside. She said it could interfere with her development and that children shouldn't mix so much with their employers." The words were a clear euphemism for an order. Katerina was starting to see Lena not as an invisible child, but as a connection, a point of access Arthur had to a truth she wanted to keep buried. The threat, for now, was subtle, a forced separation. But Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Katerina was beginning to realize that the child she had dismissed as insignificant could, in fact, be the key to unraveling her entire scheme. The battle for the truth was about to become far more dangerous. Katerina's attempt to sideline Lena was the first aggressive move on the chessboard Arthur's life had become. He couldn't allow it. Confronting her directly was out of the question. That would put her on high alert. He needed a more strategic approach, using the same manipulative subtlety she mastered so well. That night at dinner, he broached the subject with a rehearsed calm. "Honey, I spoke with Clara today. She seemed a little worried about Lena." He paused, watching her reaction. Katerina raised her eyebrows, her expression a mask of innocence. "Worried? About what?" "She mentioned you suggested Lena spend less time with us. I just got to thinking. The girl loves being here. And frankly, I love having her around. The house feels so much more cheerful." he smiled, a smile that cost him all his energy. "I know you're only thinking of her well-being, but I don't want Clara to think we're bothered. Quite the opposite. I was even thinking of enrolling Lena in a local art school. I'd pay for it, of course. She's so talented with her drawings." It was a risky move, a gamble on her greed and her need to maintain the facade of the supportive wife. Katerina's eyes glinted for an instant. The offer to pay for the girl's education was an extravagant gesture of generosity, exactly the kind of behavior she expected and exploited in him. To reject the idea would make her seem callous and might raise suspicion. "Oh, Arthur, that's wonderful," she exclaimed, her tone turning warm and affectionate again. "What a generous idea. Of course, darling, if it makes you happy. I was just worried the girl was getting in our way." She had conceded, but Arthur saw a new glint in her eye, a rapid calculation. She would allow Lena to stay, but her surveillance of the child would increase. The Cold War had escalated. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion grew even thicker. Katerina now watched every interaction between Arthur and Lena with the eyes of a hawk. And then the accidents began. They were small things, almost insignificant, easily dismissed as coincidences. One day, Lena's favorite swing in the garden was found with its rope mysteriously frayed, nearly severed. On another occasion, a jar of jelly Lena loved was found with a strange, chemical smell, causing Clara to throw it out before the girl could eat any. The peak came when Lena's bicycle, which she always left propped against the garage wall, was found lying behind Arthur's car in his blind spot. Moments before, he was about to back out. It was Clara herself who saw it and pulled it away, screaming in shock at what could have happened. Each incident was subtle, with no witnesses, no proof. But to Arthur, the pattern was crystal clear. Katerina was no longer just trying to push Lena away. She was sending warnings. They were veiled threats, silent messages to him and the girl, showing that she wouldn't hesitate to escalate things if she felt her secret was in danger. The fear Arthur now felt was no longer for himself, his money, or his broken heart. It was a visceral, protective fear for the safety of an innocent child who had been dragged into the center of a dangerous web simply for telling the truth. He called Richard, his voice tense. "She's going after the girl, Richard, subtly, but she is. We're out of time. We need to move things forward." Before one of these accidents becomes all too real, Arthur's warning put Richard and his small team of investigators on high alert. The threat to a child completely changed the nature of the game. It was no longer about financial recovery or legal justice. It was a race against time to ensure the safety of Lena and her mother. Richard acted quickly, under the pretext of a property-wide security upgrade. He discreetly installed microphones and cameras in the mansion's common areas, the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and crucially, the office where Katerina often made her private calls. Arthur felt a pang of violating his own privacy, but he pushed it away. The woman living in his house had already violated everything he held sacred. He was just leveling the playing field. The first useful recording came 2 days later. Katerina was in her office, speaking on the phone in the same Slavic language Arthur had heard before. This time, however, the conversation was captured with crystal clarity. Richard sent the recording to a certified translator. The transcript arrived in Arthur's email late that night, and he read it with his heart in his throat. Katerina wasn't speaking to a single accomplice. She was reporting to someone, an authority figure she referred to as the director. She detailed the progress of the asset extraction from Arthur, complained about his tiresome naivete, and most chillingly discussed the child complication. "She is becoming a liability," the translation read. "The target is overly attached. I have attempted subtle containment measures, but a more permanent solution for the mother and daughter may be required. Perhaps a long vacation back to their home country." The threat was unmistakable. Vacation was a euphemism for deportation or worse. Katerina was part of something much larger, an organization, a network with a hierarchy and protocols. What had seemed like a personal betrayal was, in fact, an impersonal and methodical criminal operation. He, Arthur, was just the target. Lena, the complication. The dehumanization of it all made him nauseous. He looked out his bedroom window at the small house at the back of the property where Clara and Lena slept, and he felt a surge of protective fury. He would not let anything happen to them. The next day, another discovery came to light, this time from the financial investigation. Richard had traced the payments for the cellar renovation. As Arthur suspected, the costs had been massively inflated. The construction company was a front, and the bulk of the money Arthur had paid was rerouted to the same offshore account where Katerina was funneling his investments. She had not only used the renovation to hide the briefcase, she had profited from the very act of concealment, robbing him twice in the same move. Her audacity was limitless. She had built her hiding place with his money and pocketed the change. Armed with this new information, Arthur felt a shift within himself. The pain and humiliation were still there, but they were now overshadowed by a cold determination. He was no longer the helpless victim. He was an adversary. He understood that to beat Katerina, he had to think like her. He had to anticipate her moves, use her own tactics against her. The next step, he knew, was to find out more about the director and the scope of this network. And the key to that, he suspected, still lay in the photographic memory of little Lena. He had to find a way to access those memories without putting her in more danger, a task that seemed nearly impossible under the watchful eyes of his predatory wife. The need to protect Lena while simultaneously accessing her crucial memories demanded an ingenious plan. Arthur spent a sleepless night architecting a strategy that was both safe and effective. The idea came to him at dawn, simple and brilliant in its design. He would use Lena's passion for drawing. The next morning, he presented the girl with a huge art kit, complete with pencils of every color, crayons, watercolors, and a large sketch pad. "How about a new game, Lena?" he proposed with a warm smile, sitting with her on the back patio, a visible open location so as not to arouse Katerina's suspicions. "Let's call it the memory game. I'll tell you a story, and you draw everything you remember about it." He started with simple stories: a picnic in the park, a visit to the zoo. Lena, delighted, drew with fierce concentration, her little sketches capturing details he himself had forgotten. Then, with a tight chest, he steered the game to the topic that mattered. "Now, let's remember the time Aunt Bella was fixing up the wine cellar. Remember the men who helped her. Can you draw them for me? Try to remember everything, what their faces looked like, the clothes they wore." Lena dove into the task. Under her small hand, two faces began to take shape. One tall, thin man with a hooked nose, the other shorter and stockier, with a thick mustache and a small scar above his eyebrow. The details were stunning. "They had a car," Lena said, her eyes never leaving the paper. "A white van. It had a drawing of a blue bird on the door." Arthur felt a shiver. This was exactly the kind of detail the investigators needed. As Lena drew, he saw Katerina watching them from the kitchen window. She was smiling, but her eyes were slits of suspicion. He knew he was taking a calculated risk. Just then, Clara approached, bringing a glass of juice for her daughter. Arthur seized the opportunity. In a low voice, while Katerina was momentarily distracted on the phone, he spoke to the housekeeper, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. "Clara, I need you to trust me. You and Lena are in danger. I need you to pack a small bag, just the essentials. Tonight, after everyone is asleep, a car will come for you. It's a friend of mine, Richard. He will take you to a safe place." Clara's face went white. Fear and confusion filled her eyes. "Danger? Mr. Arthur, what are you talking about?" I can't explain everything right now, but Isabella, that she is not who she seems. Please, Clara, for Lena's safety, trust me." He saw the internal struggle on the woman's face, her loyalty to him, her fear of the unknown. But when she looked down at her daughter, drawing innocently in the sun, the decision settled in her eyes. She nodded, a single tear rolling down her cheek. That night, the tension in the mansion was almost physical. Katerina, sensing something was amiss, grew restless and irritable. She questioned Arthur about his phone calls, about his conversation with Clara. He deflected with vague excuses, his heart hammering with every lie. When they finally went up to their room, she surprised him. "Arthur, I was thinking," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "Maybe it's time we took that trip to Europe we always planned. Just the two of us. We could leave tomorrow." It was a trap, an attempt to isolate him, to take him out of the game while her accomplices dealt with the complication. "That's a wonderful idea, my love," he replied, his stomach churning. "Let's talk about it in the morning." He knew there would be no morning. The endgame was here. The pre-dawn silence was heavy, oppressive. Arthur feigned sleep, every muscle tensed, listening to Katerina's rhythmic breathing beside him. The sound, once calming, was now the ticking of a time bomb. The plan was simple. As soon as Richard's car arrived, he would get a text message. That would be the signal to create a diversion, allowing Clara and Lena to slip out of the back house unnoticed. But the phone in his hand, hidden under the blanket, remained dark. The minutes crawled by like hours. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't his phone. It was Katerina's, vibrating softly on the nightstand. She stirred, answering the call with an agility that betrayed her supposed sleep. She whispered in her foreign tongue, the words short and urgent. Arthur felt his blood run cold. They knew, somehow, they knew the plan. Katerina hung up, and the ensuing silence was even more terrifying. She didn't move. She lay perfectly still for a long, agonizing minute. Then, slowly, she turned to him in the darkness. "Do you think I'm stupid, Arthur?" Her voice was an icy whisper, devoid of any warmth or pretense. The mask had dropped completely, revealing the face of a cornered predator. "You and your little informant. Did you really think you could fool me?" She rose from the bed in one fluid motion and went to the window. She looked out toward Clara and Lena's cottage. They're already on their way, to make sure the complication is resolved permanently, unless you do exactly as I say. Panic threatened to suffocate Arthur, but adrenaline kept him focused. Lena was in imminent danger. He no longer had time for strategy or subtlety. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice steady despite the terror he felt. "Transfers. Now, everything that's left in your primary accounts. Then, we're going on that trip. And you will smile for the cameras at the airport, like the happy husband you are. The girl and her mother might have a chance to disappear quietly if you cooperate." It was an ultimatum. His fortune for Lena's life. There was no choice. But as he walked toward his office, Katerina following close behind, his brain was working furiously. He needed to buy time. Sitting at his computer, he began the transfer process, his fingers deliberately slow and shaky. "I'm nervous. My hands won't stop shaking," he said, a plausible excuse. With every second he gained, his hope grew that Richard would realize the plan had gone wrong. It was then that he saw it. Through the office window, which overlooked the side entrance to the property, he saw the gleam of approaching headlights. It wasn't Richard's discreet sedan. It was a white van with a blue bird painted on the door. They had arrived. In that instant, the house plunged into darkness, a blackout. Richard, in a stroke of genius or sheer luck, had cut the power to the estate. Katerina let out a curse. In the momentary chaos, Arthur acted. He shoved the heavy desk lamp in her direction, making her recoil with a shout, and bolted from the office. He didn't run for the exit. He ran for Lena. He had to get to her before the men in the van did. He scrambled down the stairs in the dark, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could hear men breaking down the door of the small cottage. He burst through the mansion's back door, sprinting across the dark lawn. "Lena!" he screamed. The cottage door was splintered open. Clara was groaning on the floor, and two men, the faces from Lena's drawings, were dragging the terrified girl outside. Lena saw him and screamed his name, a sound of pure terror. Without thinking, Arthur launched himself at the man holding Lena, fury giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. The collision was brutal. Arthur, driven by a primal rage, knocked the man holding Lena to the ground, forcing him to release the girl. The second man, caught off guard, turned on him, but before he could react, blinding lights flooded the garden. Sirens sliced through the night's silence. Richard hadn't just cut the power, he'd brought backup. Police officers surrounded the property, their firm voices ordering the men to surrender. Katerina's accomplices, seeing they were trapped, hesitated for a moment before dropping their weapons and raising their hands. Arthur wasted no time. He scooped Lena into his arms and rushed to Clara's side as she struggled to her feet. Her face etched with pain, but her eyes locked on her daughter. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and adrenaline, holding them both tightly. Inside the mansion, Katerina knew the game was over. Her escape route was cut off, her accomplices captured. When the police entered the house, they found her in the office, not in a panic, but with an unnerving calm. She was sitting in her chair, methodically destroying a SIM card. She looked up at the officers with cold contempt, the queen of a crumbled empire. There were no pleas, no tears, no attempts at manipulation. The actress had left the stage, only the calculating criminal remained. The final confrontation between Arthur and Katerina happened hours later in a cold, impersonal room at the police station. She looked at him through the glass, her expression blank. He had expected to feel hatred, anger, maybe even a remnant of the pain of betrayal. But all he felt was a profound emptiness, an absence of any emotion for this stranger. "Why?" he asked. His voice piped through an intercom. She shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "It was my job. You were just another contract. Nothing personal." The words, meant to wound, to reduce him to a mere business transaction, had the opposite effect. They set him free. The love he had felt wasn't for her, but for the character she had created, and that character had never existed. He hadn't lost Isabella. He had finally been rid of Katerina. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the criminal network was unraveled. The information on Katerina's laptop, combined with the detailed testimony that Lena's photographic memory provided, led to arrests in several countries. The director was identified and captured. The organization, specializing in marriage fraud against high net worth targets, was dismantled. Life at the mansion slowly began to reset. The silence left by Katerina's absence was gradually filled with new sounds. Lena's laughter echoing in the hallways, quiet conversations between Arthur and Clara in the kitchen, the sound of colored pencils scratching on paper. Arthur began the legal process of annulling his fraudulent marriage. More importantly, he began another process, one that came from his heart. He sat down with Clara and, with a sincerity he hadn't felt in a long time, made her a proposal. He wanted to legally adopt Lena. He wanted to give her the future, the security, and the love of a father. And he wanted Clara to stay, not as his housekeeper, but as part of his new, unexpected family. Clara's tears, this time, were not of fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. Amid the wreckage of a life of lies, Arthur had found the foundation to build a real family, forged in honesty, courage, and mutual protection. 7 weeks after that golden Sunday afternoon, the smell of fresh paint in the wine cellar had finally dissipated, replaced by the familiar aroma of old wood and earth. Arthur descended the stone steps, but this time he wasn't alone. nor was he looking for wine for a fake party. Lena was by his side, holding his hand with the confidence of someone who belonged. They carried a small bucket of mortar and a trowel. The hole in the wall, the ugly scar that had witnessed the discovery of his ruin, would now become a symbol of his liberation. He carefully showed her how to apply the mortar, and together they sealed the opening, layer by layer. They weren't hiding a secret, but building a new foundation, solid and true. "There," he said, smoothing the final layer. "No more false walls in this house." Lena smiled and pressed her small hand into the wet mortar, leaving her mark. "No more," she repeated, with the solemnity of an oath. The cellar, once a place of trauma, was transformed. Within weeks, it became the most incredible playroom a 6-year-old could dream of. Arthur's transformation was even more profound. The wound of betrayal had scarred over, leaving behind not a paralyzing bitterness, but a newfound wisdom. He didn't lose his capacity to trust. He learned how to aim it. His generosity, once a vulnerability, became his greatest strength, now applied to those who truly deserved it. His new family. He recovered most of his fortune, but discovered that true wealth wasn't in his bank accounts, but in Lena's tight hugs before bed and the shared meals with Clara, where the conversation was simple and honest. The mansion, once a stage for an elaborate performance, became a home. The laughter that now filled its rooms was genuine, the joy palpable. Clara, no longer just an employee, became the house manager and, more importantly, the quiet, strong matriarch of their unlikely family. On an autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fell softly in the garden, Arthur watched Lena run across the grass, her dark hair flying in the wind. He thought of Katerina, a distant, ghostly figure serving her sentence in a prison thousands of miles away. He felt nothing for her, not even pity. She was just a painful but necessary chapter in his story. The storm that had cleared the ground so that something new and beautiful could grow. He learned that true love doesn't need secrets or false walls to hide behind. It thrives in the daylight, in transparency and truth. And he learned that sometimes the deepest wisdom about human character comes not from a lifetime of experience, but from the pure, uncorrupted voice of a child. The little girl his ex-wife had deemed too invisible to be a threat had not only saved him from a life of deceit, but had also given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to discover what it meant to be truly loved. He bent down as Lena ran toward him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. In that embrace, he found the only truth that mattered, sealed not with mortar, but with the unconditional honesty and love that form the true bonds of family.